The email came on a Tuesday morning, between my second cup of coffee and a compliance report I'd been putting off for 3 days. The subject line read, Requested records. Enrollment cancellation log, August 14. I had requested those records myself. I knew what the system contained. I had worked with files like this for 6 years, but seeing the name in that field, the phone number I had memorized before I could drive, I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I simply closed my office door, sat back down, and read it again. What my parents did not know was that the institution they had called 10 years ago to erase my future now signed my paychecks, and the woman who answered their request back then. She reported to me, Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. And hit like and subscribe if you have ever worked twice as hard just to get back what someone quietly took from you. My name is Anna Mitchell. I am 32 years old, and I work as a senior financial aid compliance officer at Hartwell University in Hartford, Connecticut. If you had told me at 22 that I would end up here, in this building, in this role, with access to every enrollment record this institution has generated since 1987, I would not have believed you. Not because the job seemed out of reach, but because Hartwell was the school that was supposed to change my life the first time. The school I never got to attend. I will come back to that. First, let me tell you who I am, so you understand what I mean when I say that nothing about what happened to me was an accident, and nothing about what I did next was impulsive. I grew up in Glastonbury, Connecticut. It is the kind of town that looks like a Christmas card from the outside. Wide streets, old maples, houses with wraparound porches, and American flags that stay out past Labor Day. My parents, Richard and Diane Mitchell, had lived in the same colonial on Western Boulevard for 30 years. Richard was a project manager at a civil engineering firm. Diane ran the hospitality committee at their church and made a sweet potato casserole that people requested by name at every potluck from September through December. From the outside, we were unremarkable in the best possible way. Stable, respectable, the kind of family that remembered birthdays and showed up to things. From the inside, we were a house with two different sets of rules, and I had understood which set applied to me before I started middle school. My brother Gerald is 3 years younger than I am. He is the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately begins talking about himself, and somehow this quality was interpreted by our parents not as a flaw but as charisma. Gerald had opinions. Gerald had plans. Gerald had potential. These were the words that circled him like satellites for as long as I can remember. Potential, promise, future. I had chores. I want to be careful here, because I am not interested in making myself sound like a victim of something dramatic. There were no locked doors. No one hit me. What there was instead was a steady, patient architecture of diminishment that I mistook for normal until I was old enough to see it clearly. Gerald's grades were celebrated. Mine were expected. Gerald's friends were welcomed into the house. Mine were told we were busy. When Gerald quit the swim team after 2 weeks because he didn't like getting up early, my father said, he knows his own mind. When I asked to take a Saturday art class in 9th grade, my mother said we couldn't afford it, then spent that same weekend driving Gerald 2 hours each way to a baseball showcase. I learned early that the fastest way to keep the peace in our house was to need less. So I did. I pulled back. I studied quietly. I applied for things without telling anyone, because telling anyone meant having the possibility managed before it became real. Hartwell University was one of those things. I found out about their academic scholarship program through a guidance counselor in junior year. Full tuition, renewable for 4 years based on GPA and a written portfolio. I spent 4 months on that application. I wrote 3 drafts of every essay. I did not tell my parents I had applied until the acceptance letter arrived in March of my senior year. And even then, I waited 2 days before I brought it to the dinner table. My father looked at it for a long time without saying anything. My mother asked how far the campus was from home. Gerald, who was 14, said, "Cool," and went back to his phone. The scholarship covered tuition and fees. I had saved enough from 2 years of weekend waitressing to cover my share of room and board. I had a plan. I had a move-in date. I had a checklist taped to the inside of my closet door, with items crossed off one by one through June and July. What I did not have, what I did not think to verify, because I was 18 and I trusted my parents to be on my side, was confirmation that my enrollment was still active. That is how the system works, and I know this now better than almost anyone. When a student is accepted and confirms their intent to enroll, the university creates an active enrollment record. That record can be modified, it can be deferred, and under certain circumstances, with the right information provided by a caller, it can be cancelled. I know exactly what information was provided. I have read the log, but I am getting ahead of myself. In August of that year, 2 weeks before my scheduled move-in date, my mother sat down across from me at the kitchen table with the expression she used when she was about to deliver news that was not her fault. She folded her hands. She said the financial aid office had called. She said there had been a review of my scholarship eligibility and that a discrepancy had been found. She said the award had been rescinded. I remember the fluorescent light in the kitchen humming. I remember the pattern on the tablecloth, blue and white checks, one corner slightly frayed. I remember thinking, this is not real. And then I remember thinking, of course it is. I was 18. I had spent years learning not to push back, not to demand, not to take up more space than I was given. I asked one question, can I call them? My mother said she had already spoken to someone and there was nothing to be done. My father was not home. Gerald was at a friend's house. I went to my room and I sat on the floor next to my half-packed boxes and I did not make a sound. That was the last summer I lived in that house. Not because I left dramatically, but because over the next few months, something in me went very quiet in a way that was different from before. I got a full-time job at an insurance office. I took community college courses at night. I sent Gerald school supplies when Diane asked me to chip in. I told myself I was regrouping. What I did not know was that there was nothing to regroup from. The scholarship had not been rescinded for a discrepancy. It had been cancelled by a phone call. One phone call, 8 minutes long, according to the timestamp I would read a decade later. The person who made that call did it on a Tuesday morning, which I find interesting now. We are creatures of habit. Even when we are doing something we will never admit to. I did not know any of this yet. But I had begun, slowly and without quite realizing it, to build a life that would one day give me access to exactly the file that contained the truth. And that file had been sitting in Hartwell's system, untouched for 10 years. Waiting the summer before I was supposed to start at Hartwell was the last summer. I believed my parents were fundamentally good people who sometimes made bad decisions. I want to mark that clearly, because the line between those two things matters. Bad decisions can be forgiven. What was done to me was not a decision made in a moment of fear or financial panic. It was planned, it was executed, and it was covered with enough plausible detail that a grieving 18-year-old would not think to question it. I did not question it. August in Glastonbury that year was brutal. The kind of heat that sits on your chest when you walk outside, that makes the air above the asphalt ripple and bend. I had finished packing by the first week of the month, 2 large duffel bags and a plastic storage bin with a cracked lid I'd found at a church sale. Inside, twin sheets in a color the package called sage, a desk lamp, 3 textbooks I'd bought used from a senior who'd taken the same intro courses, and a photograph of the Connecticut River I'd printed at the library and rolled into a cardboard tube so it wouldn't crease. I was ready. Move-in was August 28th. I had the date circled on a calendar I'd torn from a Hartwell viewbook and taped above my desk. On August 17th, my mother came to find me. I was in the backyard with a book, sitting on the concrete step at the back of the house where the sun hit in the late afternoon. She came through the sliding door and stood for a moment without saying anything, which was always how she preceded news. She had already decided how to deliver. She sat down next to me on the step. She said, I got a call from the financial aid office today. I closed my book. She said the scholarship had undergone a routine eligibility review. She said that in reviewing my application, they had found a discrepancy in the household income documentation. She used the word discrepancy twice. She said the award had been rescinded and that my enrollment confirmation had been cancelled as a result. Her voice was even, almost gentle. The way you speak to someone you are trying not to upset. I asked her what kind of discrepancy. She said she wasn't sure exactly, that the person she spoke with had used a lot of technical language. I asked if I could call them myself. She said she had already spoken to a supervisor and been assured there was no appeals process for this category of error. She said she was sorry, then she went back inside. I sat on that step for a long time after the sliding door closed. The neighbor's sprinkler came on and ran its cycle and turned off again. A car went by. 2 dogs barked at each other from opposite yards. I did not cry, not right away. What I felt first was something more like vertigo. The particular sensation of a floor you believed was solid turning out to be suspended over nothing. I had built everything around that date. August 28th. the sage sheets, the river photograph in its cardboard tube. When I finally went inside, my father was home. He was at the kitchen table with the newspaper and a glass of iced tea. I stood in the doorway and told him what Mom had said. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something confirmed what he'd already suspected. He said, "These things happen, Anna. It's not the end of the world." Gerald was in the living room playing video games. He didn't look up. That night, I called the financial aid office at Hartwell from the phone in my bedroom. Door closed, voice low. A recorded message told me office hours were Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30. I called back the next morning. A woman answered. I gave her my name and student ID number and told her I was calling about my scholarship. She put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, she said my enrollment record showed a cancellation dated August 14th, initiated at the request of a family member due to a family emergency. She said the scholarship had been released as a result, family emergency. I said, "I'm sorry, can you tell me who made that request?" She said she wasn't able to share that information over the phone. She said if I wanted to dispute the cancellation, I would need to submit a written appeal with supporting documentation within 30 days. I was 18. I did not know what supporting documentation meant in this context. I did not know that, initiated at the request of a family member, meant a specific name was attached to that request in a log that was time-stamped and stored in a database. I did not know that 30 days was enough time. If I had pushed, if I had shown up in person, if I had understood what I was dealing with. I knew none of that. I knew only what my mother had told me, and my mother had given me a version of events smooth enough that there was nowhere to grip. I wrote the appeal. I wrote it carefully, 3 pages, asking for reconsideration and explaining that I had prepared for this enrollment for over a year. I mailed it certified mail. 3 weeks later, I received a form letter informing me that my appeal had been reviewed and that the decision stood. I have that letter still. It is in a manila folder in my filing cabinet at home, behind my birth certificate and my lease. I kept it because I was not sure for a long time whether I was angry at Hartwell or at myself. I kept it the way you keep evidence of something you don't yet have a name for. By September, I had a full-time job answering phones at an insurance brokerage on New Britain Avenue. By October, I had enrolled in 2-night courses at Manchester Community College. Introduction to Business Administration, English Composition 2. My mother told people I had decided to take a gap year to figure out what I really wanted. Gerald started high school that fall. My parents bought him a laptop, a graphing calculator, and new cleats for the soccer team. My mother made his favorite dinner, chicken piccata, on the first day of school. I ate cereal at the kitchen counter before my 6 a.m. shift and did not say anything about any of it. What I was learning, in those months without having a framework for it yet, was how to move through a kind of grief that has no funeral. No one acknowledged what had been lost. No one spoke about Hartwell again. The storage bin with the cracked lid went into the basement. The river photograph stayed in its cardboard tube for 2 years before I finally unrolled it and taped it to the wall of my first apartment. The sage sheets I still use. I don't know why. Maybe because they were mine before any of this happened, and I needed at least one thing that stayed. At community college that fall, my English position professor handed back our first essay with a note at the bottom of mine that said, "This is the work of someone who thinks carefully. Keep going." I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. On the bus home that evening, I read it 3 more times. I kept going. I did not yet know where I was going, or that the place I was headed had already been part of this story from the beginning. I did not know that the institution that had sent me a form letter declining my appeal was the same institution where, 9 years later, I would be the person other people called when something in an enrollment record did not add up. I only knew that I was not done. And in our house, in those years, that was the most dangerous thing I could have been. The years between losing Hartwell and finding my way back to it do not make for a dramatic story. There was no single turning point, no mentor who appeared at the right moment, no scholarship committee that recognized hidden genius and swept me toward a second chance. What there was instead was arithmetic. Small decisions added together over a long time that eventually produced a different life than the one I had been left with. I want to tell you about those years honestly, because I think the honest version matters more than the inspiring one. I worked at the insurance brokerage for 2 years. I was good at it, Not because I loved insurance, but because I am organized in a way that feels almost involuntary, the kind of organized that comes from growing up in a house where no one else kept track of things and someone had to. I learned the filing systems. I learned the billing software. I stayed late without being asked. My supervisor, a woman named Roberta, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and kept a can of mixed nuts on her desk that she never offered to share, told me at my one-year review that I was the most reliable person she'd had in that role in 6 years. She gave me a 2% raise. I took it and said thank you, and went back to my desk and spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about what reliable was worth and whether I was spending it correctly. At night, I took classes, 1 or 2 per semester, whatever I could manage around shifts. I finished my associate's degree at Manchester in 3 years instead of 2, because I could only go part-time. I paid for it myself, semester by semester, with no loans. My parents never asked how school was going. When I mentioned in passing that I'd made the dean's list one semester, my mother said that was nice and asked if I'd talked to Gerald lately, because he was having trouble with his history teacher. Gerald, by then, was a junior in high school. He had quit soccer, joined the debate team, quit the debate team, and developed an intense but brief interest in becoming an architect. My parent had hired him a tutor for the SATs. The tutor cost $400 a month. I paid $430 a month in rent. When I graduated from Manchester, I applied to 3 four-year programs. I was accepted to all 3. The best offer came from the University of Connecticut, a transfer scholarship covering 60% of tuition, the rest eligible for need-based aid. I did the math 6 different ways before I let myself believe it was real. I told my parents over the phone. There was a pause, and then my mother said, "Well, UConn is a good school, not congratulations, not I'm proud of you." Good school, the way you'd describe a solid but unspectacular restaurant. My father said, "Make sure you read everything before you sign anything," which would later strike me as the most precisely wrong advice he could have given everything. I moved to Stores that August. My apartment was a 12-minute walk from campus. It was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and radiator heat, and the window in the kitchen faced a parking lot, and I loved it with a completeness I still find difficult to explain. It was mine. Every square foot of it, paid for by hours I had worked, credits I had earned, paperwork I had filed myself, verified myself, confirmed myself. I did not tell anyone my move-in date. I did not wait for anyone to come help me carry boxes. I studied finance and public administration. I was older than most of my classmates by 3 or 4 years, which at 23 feels like a generation. I did not mind. I had always been more comfortable with structure than with socializing, and the coursework gave me structure in abundance. Policy frameworks, institutional compliance, the regulatory architecture of higher education funding. These were not glamorous subjects, but they mapped cleanly onto the way my brain had always worked, the part of me that wanted to know exactly how systems operated and where the gaps were. In my senior year, I applied for a graduate fellowship in higher education administration. It included a placement component, 6 months embedded in a university financial aid office. The placement list had 12 institutions on it. Hartwell University was number 7. I stared at that name on the page for a long time. Then I ranked it first. I want to be honest about why. It was not at that point about my parents. I had not yet connected the dots I would later connect. What I felt when I saw Hartwell's name was something older and less specific. A pull toward unfinished business that I could not have fully articulated. I had applied there once. I had been accepted. Something had gone wrong in a way that had never quite made sense to me, though I had long since stopped pulling at that thread. I ranked it first, because it felt like returning to a room I had been removed from and walking back in under my own power. I got the placement. I started at Hartwell in January, embedded in the Financial Aid Compliance Division. My supervisor was a quiet, precise man named David Okafor, who communicated almost entirely in written memos and expected the same in return. He showed me the database on my first morning, the full enrollment management system, every record going back to the university's conversion to digital filing in 1991. He showed me how to pull records, how to read log entries, how to trace the history of a file from creation to present. The system remembers everything, he told me. People forget that. I did not forget it. By the time I was offered a permanent position at Hartwell 18 months later, I had been inside that system long enough to understand it, the way you understand a language you have been studying for years. Not just the words, but the grammar, the idioms, the places where meaning hides. I accepted the position. I moved to Hartford. I found an apartment near Bushnell Park with high ceilings and original hardwood floors and a kitchen window that faced east, so the morning light came in clean and flat and stayed for 2 hours. I called my mother to give her my new address, in case of emergency. She asked if Gerald could borrow my old car since he'd had a fender bender, and his insurance was being difficult. I said I'd think about it. I did not call back. Gerald was 24 by then, and working at a marketing firm his college roommate's father had gotten him into. He had a nice apartment in West Hartford that I would later learn my parents were quietly supplementing to the tune of $800 a month. He called me twice a year, once near my birthday, once around Christmas, always with some variation of the same conversational shape. Pleasantries, catch up, and then, at some point in the third or fourth minute, a pivot towards something he needed. I began to feel, in those years, the faint persistent pressure of a question I had never allowed myself to ask directly. The story my mother had told me, discrepancy, review, precision, had always sat slightly wrong in my memory. The way a piece of furniture sits wrong in a room when it's 2 inches off from where it belongs. Not obviously wrong. Just not quite right. I had not pulled that thread. I had been afraid, I think, of what unraveling it might cost me. The energy, the grief, the confrontation with something I might not be able to put back. But I worked with enrollment records every day. I knew what was in them. I knew what a cancellation log contained. And I had known for a long time, in the part of myself I kept very quiet, that if I ever wanted to know what had actually happened, I had access to exactly the system that would tell me. I just had not opened the door. Not yet. The file that changed everything did not announce itself. That is the thing about truth that has been sitting in a database for 10 years. It does not glow, it does not send warnings, it does not prepare you. It sits in a row with 10,000 other rows, labeled and time-stamped and utterly patient, waiting for the moment someone with the right credentials and the right search parameters decides to look. I almost did not look. It was a Wednesday in late October, the kind of afternoon that arrives in Connecticut like a closing argument. Cold light, bare branches, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the block. I was working late on a compliance audit for financial aid office, specifically a retrospective review of cancellation procedures from the early 2000s through 2015. The university had updated its verification protocols in 2016, requiring identity confirmation before any enrollment action could be taken by a third party. My job was to document the previous process, identify cases where the old system's gaps had created problems, and produce a policy brief for the provost's office, routine work. The kind of thing I did well and found satisfying in a quiet, methodical way. I was pulling case records in chronological batches, scanning for patterns, calls from third parties, cancellations without student confirmation, cases where the reason field had been filled with vague language. I was 3 hours into it. My coffee had gone cold. The cleaning crew had already come and gone from my floor. I pulled a batch dated August 2014, case number HR 2SU1FI081142. I almost scrolled past it. I have thought about this moment many times since. The fraction of a second in which it nearly didn't happen, in which I might have kept moving and never known. What stopped me was not intuition. It was not some cinematic sense of recognition. It was the date, August 14, 2014. I knew that date. I had not thought about it consciously in years. But the number lived somewhere in the back of my memory the way certain things do, not recalled, just present. The day the call had come, the day my mother had sat down next to me on the back step and folded her hands. I stopped scrolling. I opened the case. The record loaded in sections, student ID first, then enrollment status, then the action log. I read the student ID and my vision did something strange, a kind of doubling, where I understood the information before I understood that I understood it. The student ID was mine. I sat very still for a moment. The office was quiet. The heating system clicked and hummed. Outside the window, the parking lot lights had come on, orange and flat against the darkening sky. I kept reading. The action log showed a single entry. Timestamp. August 14, 2014, 10:23 a.m. Action type, enrollment cancellation, third-party request. Duration of call, 8 minutes, 17 seconds. Reason provided by caller, family emergency, student will not be attending. And then, in the field marked caller information. Required by the system even then, though not yet verified. Name, Diane Mitchell. Phone number, the number I had called home my entire childhood. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time, slowly. The way you read something when you are trying to locate the part of it that must be a mistake. There was no mistake. I did not scream. I did not push back from my desk. I did not call anyone. What I did was open a new document, copy the case number, and begin typing a formal record request to the registrar's office. The full file, the complete call log, all associated documentation, citing my compliance audit as the official basis for the request. I wrote it in the same tone I used for every interdepartmental communication: clear, specific, appropriately formal. Then I saved it, flagged it for morning, and sat in my chair for a while without doing anything else. I want to try to describe what I felt in that hour, because it was not what I would have expected. It was not rage, though rage would come later, in smaller doses, at unexpected moments. Driving home, making dinner, folding laundry. What I felt first, sitting in that office with the heating system clicking and the parking lot lights glowing orange outside, was something closer to resolution. The particular sensation of a question you have been carrying for so long it had become part of your posture. And then setting it down. I had not imagined my parents' betrayal. I had not misremembered or catastrophized or been too sensitive. Something had happened in August of 2014 that had rerouted the entire trajectory of my life, and for 10 years I had half believed, in the weakest and most corrosive part of myself, that maybe it had been my fault somehow. Maybe the discrepancy had been real. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe I was not as prepared as I'd thought. I had not missed anything. There was no discrepancy. There was a phone call. 8 minutes and 17 seconds. And a woman who had sat next to me on a concrete step and looked me in the eyes and said the scholarship had been rescinded. The registrar's office sent me the full file 3 days later, delivered to my work inbox with a routine interdepartmental subject line. I opened it on a Friday morning before anyone else arrived. The file contained the original enrollment record, the cancellation entry, the call log summary, and a scanned copy of the follow-up letter sent to the student address on file. My parents' house on Western Boulevard, confirming the cancellation. My parents had received a confirmation letter, in writing, and said nothing. I printed everything, all of it. I 3-hole punched the pages and put them in a navy blue binder I took from the supply cabinet, the kind, with the clear front pocket where you can slide in a label. I typed a label, I printed it, I slid it into the pocket. I put the binder in my desk drawer and locked it. Then I picked up my phone and called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Lemoine, and she had been recommended to me 2 years earlier by a colleague who had used her for a landlord dispute. She was 61 years old, methodical to the point of austerity, and had the manner of someone who had heard every variety of human behavior and found none of it particularly surprising. I told her the situation. I told her about the file. I told her about the 10 years. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Do you still have the acceptance letter?" I said I did. She said, "And the appeal you mailed after the cancellation?" I said I had the certified mail receipt and the form letter declining the appeal. She said, "Give me a week." I said, "Take 2. I hung up and looked out my office window at the campus below. The brick buildings, the elms trees dropping their last leaves, the students crossing the quad with their bags and their coffee cups and their enrollment records intact, unaltered, waiting for them in the system exactly as they had been entered. Gerald called that weekend. He needed, he said, to talk to me about something. He had a situation, a financial situation. He was thinking maybe 15,000, just to bridge a gap. He would pay it back. It wouldn't even need to be formal. I told him I was busy. I told him I would be in touch soon. I hung up before he could say anything else, and I stood in my kitchen for a moment in the quiet, and I thought about the 8 minutes and 17 seconds that had bought him 10 years. The interest on that, I decided, was going to be considerable. Gerald showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after that phone call, which was not something he had ever done before. I heard the buzzer at 9:47. I know the time because I had been up since 6, sitting at my kitchen table with Patricia Lemoine's preliminary assessment, which had arrived by email the night before, and which I had read 4 times, and then set face down on the table while I made breakfast. The assessment was 12 pages. It was not comforting reading, in the sense that comfort was not its purpose. Its purpose was clarity, and it delivered that, with the kind of precision that makes your stomach drop even when you already knew the general shape of the truth. I pressed the intercom. Gerald's voice came through, slightly distorted. saying it was him, that he was sorry to just show up, that he really needed to talk. I buzzed him in. He looked tired. Gerald has always been the kind of person whose face records everything. Stress, confidence, embarrassment, relief, in real time, with no filter. He came through my door in a fleece jacket and jeans, holding a coffee cup from the place down the block, and he looked like someone who had not slept well in several days. He sat down at my kitchen table without being asked. He looked around my apartment the way people do when they are trying to assess your circumstances without appearing to. His eyes moved to the bookshelves, the kitchen, the window with the morning light coming through. He said, "Nice place." I said, "Thank you." He said, "You've done really well for yourself, Anna." "Seriously," I said, "Gerald, what do you need?" It was not a question. He heard that and shifted in his chair and set his coffee cup down on the table and looked at his hands. The situation, as he explained it over the next 20 minutes, was this. He had been at the marketing firm for 4 years, and 18 months ago he had been passed over for a promotion he had expected. This had led to what he described as a period of disengagement, during which his performance reviews had declined, and he had begun, he said, to explore other opportunities. The exploration had not produced results. 6 weeks ago he had been let go. He had severance for 2 months, but his rent in West Hartford was $2,200 a month, his car payment was $480, and he had accumulated, across 3 credit cards, a balance of just under $19,000. He said, "I've been talking to Mom and Dad, but they're pretty tapped out right now." I said, "How tapped out?" He said they had some stuff going on with the house. He didn't want to get into it, but they couldn't help him the way they normally could. I registered the phrase, "the way they normally could," and filed it carefully. He said he needed $15,000. He said he would pay it back within a year. He said he knew it was a lot to ask, but that I had a good job and he was family, and this was the kind of thing family did for each other. He said that last part looking directly at me, with the expression of someone presenting an argument they consider self-evidently correct. I looked at him for a moment. My brother, 39 years old, sitting at my kitchen table asking me to fund the life our parents had built for him, with the time and the money and the opportunity that had been taken from me. I said, "I'm going to need some time to think about it." He looked relieved in a way that told me he had expected refusal and was recalibrating toward hope. He said, "Of course, no rush, he just needed to know in the next week or two so he could plan." I said I understood. He stayed another 30 minutes. We talked about nothing in particular. The weather, a restaurant he'd been to, a television series he was watching. He finished his coffee. He stood up and put on his jacket and said he really appreciated me hearing him out. At the door he stopped and said, "Mom mentioned Thanksgiving. She's hoping everyone can make it this year. She's making the whole spread." I said I would let her know. When he left, I stood at the window and watched him walk down the block toward the parking garage. Then I picked up my phone and called Patricia Lemoyne. She answered on the second ring, which was her custom. I told her my brother had just left. I told her what he'd asked for. She said, "Did you say yes?" "Of course not," she said. "Good." I said, "Thanksgiving is in 3 weeks. My mother is expecting the whole family." There was a pause. I could hear her clicking through something on her end, the soft percussion of a keyboard. She said, "That could work." I said, "I know." We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, I had a clearer picture of what Patricia had found in her preliminary research and what she believed we could establish. The core of it was this. The cancellation had been made by a third party, my mother, without my knowledge or consent, using personal information she had access to because I was her minor age dependent at the time of my original application. Though I was 18 by the time of the cancellation, she had represented to the university that a family emergency existed. No such emergency existed. The scholarship had been released. The funds, per our own household financial records, had not been returned to Hartwell. They had been, and here Patricia's language became precise in a way that made me grip the phone, redirected. I said, "To what?" she said, "based on what you've described about your brother's educational timeline and the financial patterns you've outlined, we'd want documentation. But the circumstantial case is fairly clear. Gerald had started at his university, a private school in Rhode Island, that same fall. His tuition for 4 years had been paid without loans. My parents had never mentioned a financial hardship that would have explained this, had in fact renovated their kitchen in 2015. I already knew all of this. I had known it the way you know things you have chosen not to examine. Hearing Patricia say it aloud was different. It made the shape of it concrete, in a way my own private knowledge had not. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The morning light had shifted, moved off the table and up the wall, the way it did by mid-morning. My coffee was cold. Patricia's email was still face down on the table where I'd left it. I turned it over. I read it again, all 12 pages, this time without stopping. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the family calendar my mother had set up years ago that she used to share holiday plans. Thanksgiving was confirmed. November 23rd. My parents' house in Glastonbury. 4 p.m. Gerald was marked as attending. 2 aunts. My father's brother and his wife. 8 people total, not counting me. 8 witnesses. I added myself to the calendar. I marked my attendance as confirmed, then I opened a new email to Patricia and typed 3 words. Thanksgiving. Let's prepare. Outside my window, the last of the elm leaves were coming down in the wind, spinning and dropping in the cold afternoon light, landing on the sidewalk below, where they would be walked over and broken into pieces and eventually swept away. I watched them for a while. I thought about my mother's voice on the intercom at Hartwell, the version of it I had imagined so many times since reading that log. Calm, even, practice, saying the words family emergency into a telephone on a Tuesday morning in August while I was at home, 2 miles away, crossing items off a move-in checklist. I thought about 8 minutes and 17 seconds. I thought about how a person can believe, for 10 years, that a door closed on its own, and then find the handprint on the other side. I was not angry, exactly. I was something quieter than angry and more durable. I had a navy blue binder in my desk drawer at work. I had a lawyer with 12 pages of preliminary findings. I had a date on a calendar. I had everything I needed. What my family did not know was that the woman they were expecting at that Thanksgiving table had spent the last 3 weeks building something they had no framework to anticipate, because it had never occurred to them that I had been paying attention all along. Gerald had called me asking for $15,000. He had no idea what he had just set in motion. The first call from my Aunt Carol came on a Monday. I was in a meeting when it came through, so I saw it afterward. A missed call, no voicemail, which with Carol meant she would try again within the hour. She did. I let it ring. She called a third time at 7 that evening, and because I knew from long experience that Carol would not stop until she had said what she'd been sent to say, I picked up. She opened with pleasantries. How was work? How was the apartment? Had I been eating well? Carol is my mother's older sister and shares with my mother a particular conversational style in which the real purpose of a call is held in reserve until a sufficient layer of warmth has been established to make refusal feel ungracious. I had grown up watching my mother do this. I recognized the architecture immediately. After 4 minutes, she said, "Your mother tells me you haven't gotten back to Gerald about the money." I said, "That's right," she said. "Anna, he's really struggling. You know how sensitive he is." I said I did know that. She said, "Family takes care of family." "That's just how it works," I said. "I hear you, Carol," she said. "Your parents have given so much to both of you over the years. It would mean a lot to them if you could step up right now." I held the phone and looked out the window at the street below, at the yellow pools of streetlight on the wet pavement. It had been raining all day. I said, "I'm going to think about it some more. I'll see everyone at Thanksgiving, and we can talk then." There was a brief pause, the kind that contains a recalibration. She said, "Okay, but Anna, don't make this harder than it needs to be." I said, "I won't." I hung up and wrote the time and the substance of the call in a small notebook I had started keeping. Date, caller, content, duration. Patricia had suggested this. She said if things developed in a certain direction, a contemporaneous record of pressure and contact would be useful. Things were developing in that direction. 3 days after Carol's call, my mother called. This was not unusual. She called every week or two, always in the early evening, always from the landline. But this call had a different quality from the first word. Her voice was controlled in a way that signaled she had planned what she was going to say, which, with my mother, usually meant she had rehearsed it. She said she had heard I was thinking about Gerald's request. I said I was still considering it. She said she hoped I would consider it carefully, because Gerald was at a real crossroads, and the family needed to pull together. I said I understood. Then she said something I wrote down verbatim in my notebook after we hung up, pressing hard enough that the pen left an indent in the page below. She said, "You've always landed on your feet, Anna, even when things didn't go the way you planned back then. You're resilient. Gerald isn't built the way you are." I did not respond for a moment. She said, "You know what I mean?" I said I do. she said. You were never someone who needed a lot of handholding. That's a gift, honestly. I said, I'll see you at Thanksgiving, Mom. When things didn't go the way you planned back then. I wrote that sentence in my notebook and underlined it twice. Not because it made me angry in the moment, though it would later, in the way slow burns work, accumulating heat without announcing themselves. I wrote it because it was the clearest encapsulation I had yet heard of the story my mother had been telling herself, and possibly others, for 10 years. The story in which I had simply not succeeded at something, the way people sometimes don't, and had adapted, because I was resilient, and moved on. Not, we made a phone call. Not, we canceled your future without telling you. Not, we took something and gave it to your brother. Just. Things didn't go the way you planned. I thought about that sentence for the rest of the week. I thought about it at work, pulling enrollment records, logging in and out of the system that had held my cancellation file for a decade. I thought about it on the drive home, on the elliptical at the gym, in the shower at 6 in the morning, when the hot water ran out faster than it should have in an apartment with old pipes. It clarified something for me. I had been uncertain, in the weeks since finding the file, about how far I wanted to take this. There is always a version of the future where you decide that knowing is enough, that you extract the truth from the archive, grieve what was taken, and walk forward without the confrontation. I had considered that version. I had held it up and looked at it honestly. My mother's sentence put it down for good. This was not, I understood then, a family that would absorb the truth quietly and reckon with it privately. This was a family that had looked at what they had done and built a narrative around it so sturdy that my mother could deploy it in a phone call without apparent discomfort. Things didn't go the way you planned, as if I had missed a bus, as if the door had simply been locked when I arrived, with no one on the other side holding it shut. I called Patricia the next morning. She had by then completed her full preliminary assessment and moved into what she called the documentation phase, compiling the financial records, the enrollment log, the timeline of Gerald's education, and my parents' spending patterns. She had also spoken to a colleague who specialized in educational fraud to get a sense of the legal landscape. She said the picture was becoming, in her words, quite detailed. She walked me through what she had. The cancellation log was the centerpiece, clear, time-stamped, my mother's name attached to the call. Supplementing it, the confirmation letter sent to my parents' address that they had received and never disclosed to me. The financial aid records from Gerald's University, obtained through a formal request, showing 4 years of tuition paid in full without loans, beginning fall 2014. Our family's tax records from 2013 and 2014, which Patricia had requested through proper channels, showing no financial hardship that would explain the simultaneous decision to cancel a full scholarship without seeking alternatives. She said, "There is also the matter of the appeal," I said. "The form letter," she said. "Yes. The form letter declining your appeal was sent to the family home address. Your parents were the ones who received your mail at that address. There is a reasonable argument that they were aware of the appeal and its outcome, and again said nothing." I sat with that for a moment. She said, "Anna, I want to ask you something directly. What outcome are you looking for?" I had thought about this. I had thought about it more carefully than I had thought about almost anything else in my adult life. I said, "I want them to be unable to pretend it didn't happen." Patricia was quiet for a beat. She said, "Then we should talk about how we structure Thanksgiving." Over the following 2 weeks, we talked. We mapped out exactly what documentation I would bring, how it would be presented, what Patricia's letter of demand, already drafted, sitting in her outbox waiting for my word, would say and when it would be sent. 3 days before Thanksgiving, she sent it. Certified mail to the Western Boulevard address. Acknowledgement of wrongful cancellation of enrollment by a third party. Request for financial restitution accounting for documented educational and career losses. 14-day response window. My parents received it the day before Thanksgiving. My mother called me that evening. I did not answer. She called again at 10 p.m. Not answers. She called a third time at 6 the next morning, Thanksgiving morning, while I was making coffee and ironing the blouse I had chosen for the occasion. A deep burgundy, fitted, the kind of thing you wear when you want to feel precise. I did not answer. I poured my coffee. I finished ironing. I stood at my kitchen window in the early morning quiet and watched the street below, empty and gray and still, the bare trees moving slightly in a wind that had come down overnight from the north. My phone buzzed one more time. Not a call. A text from Gerald. Hey, did something happen? Mom and Dad seem really stressed. Everything okay? I put the phone face down on the counter. I picked up the navy blue binder from my bag, where I had placed it the night before, and I opened it to the first page. Enrollment cancellation log, August 14, 2014, case number HR 204Ts081142. Caller, Diane Mitchell. Duration 8 minutes 17 seconds. Reason, family emergency. Student will not be attending. I read it one more time, not because I needed to, because I wanted to carry it clearly in my mind when I walked through that door. Then I closed the binder, put on my coat, and drove to Glastonbury. The house on Western Boulevard looked the way it always looked at Thanksgiving. My mother had been decorating for the holiday since before I could remember. Dried corn husks tied to the porch columns, a wreath of rust-colored leaves on the front door, two large pumpkins flanking the steps that she bought from the same farm stand on Route 2 every October. The windows were lit from inside, warm and amber against the gray November sky. There were 4 cars in the driveway and one on the street that I recognized as my Uncle Paul's Subaru. I sat in my car for 2 minutes before I went in, not because I was afraid, because I wanted to arrive at the right temperature, not hot, not cold, calibrated. I had the binder in a canvas tote bag on the passenger seat. I had rehearsed nothing. I have found in my professional life that rehearsed confrontations tend to collapse under the weight of their own preparation. You anticipate one version of events, and the actual version arrives sideways, and suddenly you are holding a script for a different play. I had not rehearsed. I had only decided what I would do, and in what order, and what I would not do under any circumstances. I would not raise my voice. I would not be drawn into a debate about memory. I would not apologize for being there. I got out of the car and went inside. The house smelled the way it always smelled on this day. Roasting turkey, butter, the particular warm starch of dinner rolls. My mother's sweet potato casserole, which I could identify by scent alone, the brown sugar and nutmeg rising from the kitchen. Someone had put on the Macy's parade in the background, the audio bleeding from the living room down the hallway, a marching band playing something indistinct. My Aunt Carol was the first person I saw. She was standing in the hallway with a glass of white wine, and she looked at me with an expression that moved through surprise into something more guarded in the space of about half a second. She said, "Anna, you came." I said, "Of course." I hung up my coat and went to the kitchen. My mother was at the stove. She heard me come in and turned, and her face did something I had never quite seen it do before, a rapid sequence of expressions that did not settle into any of the usual ones. Not the practiced warmth she deployed for company, not the mild disapproval she used with me in private. Something more unsteady. She looked, for just a moment, like someone who had been hoping I would not show up and was now recalculating everything. She said, "Anna, I've been trying to reach you," I said. "I know. I was driving." She turned back to the stove. Her shoulders were rigid in a way I recognized, the physical posture of controlled panic, everything held very tight to keep it from showing. My father was in the living room with Paul and Paul's wife, Janet. He stood up when I came in, which he rarely did, and shook my hand, which he had never done. His grip was too firm, the way grips are when someone is using the pressure to communicate something they cannot say aloud. He said, "Good to see you, Anna." I said, "You too, Dad." Gerald was in the corner of the living room near the window, on his phone, and he looked up and gave me the slightly sheepish look of someone who had asked me for money and had not yet received an answer. He said, "Hey." I said, "Hey." Carol's husband Dave was refilling his drink in the kitchen. My father's sister Ruth had not arrived yet. I found a seat in the living room. I put the canvas tote bag on the floor beside my chair. I accepted the glass of sparkling water Janet offered, and I sat, and I listened to Paul talk about a home renovation project. And I watched my mother move between the kitchen and the dining room, setting out serving dishes, adjusting things that did not need adjusting, not looking at me. Ruth arrived at 4:15. Dinner was called at 4:30. We sat down at the dining room table. My parents at either end, Gerald to my father's left, Carol and Dave across from me, Paul and Janet beside them, Ruth at the corner near the window. 8 of us. The table was set with my mother's good dishes, the cream ones with the gold rims she kept in the hutch and brought out 3 times a year. There were candles. There were cloth napkins folded into fans. My father said grace. He thanked God for the food and the family and the year's blessings. His voice was steady, but his hands, folded on the table in front of him, were not. I watched his knuckles. We passed the dishes. Turkey, stuffing, sweet potato casserole, green beans, rolls. The conversation moved the way Thanksgiving conversation always moves. Updates, compliments on the food, mild complaints about traffic. Gerald told a story about a job interview he'd had that week that he said had gone well. Carol said the stuffing was the best my mother had ever made, which she said every year. I ate. I passed dishes when asked. I answered questions when addressed. My mother did not look at me directly for the first 40 minutes. It was Gerald who created the opening, though he did not know he was doing it. He did it with the confidence of someone who has never had a reason to consider the weight of what he was about to say. He was talking about his financial situation, more openly than I would have expected, perhaps because he'd had 2 glasses of wine, and was among people who already knew. Perhaps because he had decided that transparency was the best approach with me present. He said he was getting back on his feet. He said he had some leads. He said it had been a tough year, but he was optimistic. Then he looked at me and said, "I'm really hoping Anna can help bridge the gap. We're family, right?" He smiled when he said it. An easy, open smile. The smile of someone for whom the word family has never carried a complicated weight. The table was quiet for a moment in the particular way tables go quiet when something has been said that everyone heard and no one is sure how to respond to. I set down my fork. I said, "Actually, I want to talk about something, since we're all here." My mother's head came up. My father's knuckles tightened. Carol looked at her wine glass. I reached down and picked up the canvas tote bag. I set it on the table. I opened it and took out the navy blue binder and set the binder on the table beside my plate, and I opened it to the first page. I said, "I work in enrollment compliance at Hartwell University. In October, I was conducting a retrospective audit of cancellation procedures, and I pulled a case file from August 2014. The room was very still. I said, "The case file was mine." Gerald looked confused. My father looked at the binder. My mother looked at the wall behind my head. Not at me, not at the binder, at the wall, at a point slightly above and behind me, as though she were watching something approach from a distance. I turned the binder toward the center of the table so the first page was visible. The enrollment cancellation log, the timestamp, the name. I said, "On August 14, 2014, a call was made to Hartwell's enrollment office requesting cancellation of my admission. The caller provided a family member's name and the family home phone number. The reason given was a family emergency." I paused. "The caller was Mom," Gerald said. "What?" Carol said. "Anna." My father said, "Now just a moment. I have the full call log. I have the duration. 8 minutes, 17 seconds. I have the confirmation letter that was mailed to this address afterward. I have 10 years of financial records showing that the scholarship funds that should have covered my education were redirected." My mother turned her head and looked at me then, finally directly, for the first time since I'd arrived. Her face had gone a color I did not have a word for, not pale, something more complicated than pale. The color of a person confronting the end of a version of themselves they have maintained for a very long time. She said, "Anna, you don't understand the full picture." I said, "I have the full picture. It's in the binder." Gerald put his wine glass down very carefully, as if setting it down wrong might break something. He looked at my mother. He said, slowly, "What is she talking about?" My mother did not answer him. My father said, "This is not the time or the place." I said, "It is, actually, because 3 days ago my attorney sent a letter of demand to this address. Certified mail. You both received it yesterday." I looked at my father. "You signed for it, Dad." Ruth, who had not said anything, made a small sound that was not quite a word. The candles burned. The parade audio drifted in from the living room, a distant announcer's voice describing a float. I reached back into the tote bag and took out the second document, a single page, Patricia's letter, with the Lemoyne Law Group letterhead at the top, and my parents' names below it. I set it on the table next to the binder. I said, "I am not here to argue about what happened. The record speaks for itself. I am here because you are my family, and I believed you deserved to hear this from me directly, in person, before this moves to the next stage." I folded my hands on the table. I said, "I've been waiting 10 years to sit in this room and say that. I thought you should know." The dining room was so quiet I could hear the candle flames. No one spoke for a long time. The kind of silence that descended on that dining room was not the comfortable silence of people who know each other well enough not to need words. It was the silence of a room in which every person present was separately processing the same information and arriving, at different speeds, at the same destination. The understanding that something they had assumed was solid had just been shown to be constructed, deliberately, by people they trusted, over a very long time. Gerald broke it first. He said, "Mom, not a question, not an accusation. Just the word, the way you say a name when you need someone to tell you the thing you just heard was not real." My mother did not answer him. She was still looking at me. Her hands were in her lap, below the table, and I could see from the tension in her shoulders that she was gripping something. Her napkin, her own fingers, I could not tell. Her face had settled into an expression I recognized from my childhood, the one she used when she had decided on a position and was marshaling herself to hold it. The expression of a person preparing to manage rather than respond. She said, "Anna, what you're describing is not what happened." I said, "Mom, your name is in the log." She said, "I made a call, that is true. But I made that call because the financial aid office had already been in contact with us about a discrepancy, and I was following up on their behalf. I was trying to help." The table received this in silence. I had prepared for this. Patricia had told me there would likely be a counter-narrative, deployed quickly, because people who have maintained a story for 10 years do not abandon it at the first pressure. They double down, instinctively, the way a structure leans into wind before it gives way. I said, "The log does not show an incoming contact from the financial aid office. It shows an outgoing call from this household, initiated by you, requesting cancellation. The reason you gave was a family emergency. There is no record of any prior contact from Hartwell to this address about a discrepancy." My father said, "Records aren't always complete." I looked at him. Richard Mitchell, 64 years old, sitting at the head of the table he had sat at for 30 years, in the house he had owned for 30 years. Making the argument of a man who understands that the ground is shifting and has decided to question the instruments rather than accept the reading. I said, "These records are complete, Dad. I know because I work with them every day. The system logs every contact, every call in, every call out, every action taken, every reason given. If Hartwell had called this house, it would be in the system." "It is not in the system," Paul said very quietly, to no one in particular, Lord. Janet put her hand on his arm. "Carol," said Diane. "What is going on?" My mother turned to look at Carol, and in that moment, in the shift of her gaze from me to her sister, something in her face changed. The managing expression did not disappear exactly, but it cracked at the edges, the way ice cracks, not breaking through yet, but showing where the weakness was. She said, "Carol, this is a family matter." Carol said, "I'm family." Gerald pushed his chair back from the table, not standing, just pushing back, creating distance from the table and everything on it. He looked at the binder. He looked at my mother. He said, did you cancel her enrollment?" My mother said. "It was complicated," Gerald said. "Mom," she said, "you needed to go to school, Gerald. You had opportunities that couldn't wait." Anna was Anna was resilient. She always landed on her feet. We knew she would be fine. The room received this. I did not say anything. I had learned, in 10 years of working in compliance, that there are moments when the most powerful thing you can do is stop speaking and allow the words already in the air to do their work. My mother had just said, in front of 8 people, that she had made a choice, that it had been deliberate, that it had been about Gerald, that it had been justified by her assessment of my resilience. She had not said it was a mistake. She had not said she was sorry. She had explained it. Gerald stared at her. Something was moving across his face that I had not seen there before, a kind of dismantling, the way a person looks when a belief they have held without examining is being taken apart in front of them. He said, "You used her scholarship." "For me," my mother said. "We made decisions we thought were best for this family." Gerald said, "I didn't know." My father said, "Gerald." Gerald said, louder, "I didn't know." He looked at me. His face was doing the thing it always did, recording everything in real time, and what it was recording now was something close to horror. He said, "Anna, I didn't know." I looked at him. My brother, who had grown up in the warm light of our parents' preference, who had received without knowing what had been taken to fund it, who was sitting now at the edge of a knowledge he could not unknow. I said, "I know you didn't." He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. Ruth said, from her corner near the window, "Diane, how much?" My mother said, "Ruth, please." Ruth said, "How much did you take from her?" My father said, "We didn't take anything. We made a financial decision about our family's resources." I turned to the second page of the binder. Patricia's financial summary. I had debated whether to include this. It felt in certain lights like escalation beyond what the moment required. I had included it because Patricia had been clear that documentation, presented calmly and completely, was more effective than argument. I said, This is a summary of the financial analysis my attorney has prepared. It accounts for the scholarship value, the estimated career and income differential based on my delayed educational timeline, and the documented transfers from my parents' accounts to Gerald's university billing between 2014 and 2018. I paused. The figure we are working with is $214,000. Carol made a sound. My father said, "That is an absurd number," I said. "It's a documented number." The methodology is outlined on page 3. Gerald took his face out of his hands. He looked at my father. He said, "Where did you tell me the tuition money came from?" My father did not answer. Gerald said, "You told me there was a savings account, an education fund you'd been building since I was little." My father said, "There was a fund." Gerald said, "Was it hers?" My father looked at the tablecloth. My mother said, "Richard," a warning in his name, the old signal between them, the one that meant, "Do not say more than necessary." My father said nothing. Gerald said, "Was it her money?" Ruth stood up from her chair. She was 67 years old and 4 feet 11, and she had the particular authority of a small woman who has never in her life been uncertain about where she stood. She looked at my mother and she said, "Diane, you owe this girl an answer." My mother looked at Ruth. Then she looked at me. The managing expression was gone now, fully, and what was underneath it was something I had not expected. Not remorse, not exactly, but something exhausted. Something that had been held up for a very long time and was now, in this room, in front of these people, no longer able to hold its shape. She said, "We made the best decision we could with what we had." I said, "That is not an answer," she said, "Anna." I said, "The letter my attorney sent outlines a 14-day response window." I am not asking for an answer tonight. I am not asking for anything tonight. I closed the binder. I came because you are my family, and I thought you deserved to hear this from me instead of from a legal filing. That is the only reason I am here. I picked up the binder and put it back in the tote bag. I looked around the table. Paul, who had his hand over his mouth. Janet, who was looking at the centerpiece. Carol, who was looking at my mother with an expression I could not fully read. Dave, who had not said a single word. Ruth, still standing, her hands at her sides. Gerald, who was looking at the table in front of him. My father, who was looking at nothing. My mother, who was looking at me. I picked up my napkin, folded it, and placed it beside my plate. I pushed back my chair and stood up. I said, "The turkey was good, Mom." And I picked up the tote bag and walked out of the dining room, down the hallway, past the coat rack where the dried corn husks were tied and the wreath of rust-colored leaves was hung, and out through the front door into the cold November air. I heard my mother's voice behind me, saying my name once. I did not stop. I walked to my car. I put the tote bag on the passenger seat. I started the engine and I sat for a moment in the dark, watching the amber light in my parents' windows, listening to the engine warm. Then I drove home. Patricia called me at 8:45 that evening. I was home by then, sitting on my couch in the dark with my coat still on, which I did not realize until the phone rang and the screen lit up the room, and I looked down and noticed I had not taken it off. I had driven home on autopilot, parked in the garage, come upstairs, sat down. The tote bag was still in my hand. I set it on the coffee table and answered. She said, "How did it go?" I said it went. She said, "Did you present the documents?" I said all of it. The log, the financial summary, the letter. She said, "Witnesses." I said 7. 2 aunts, an uncle and his wife, my father's sister, and my brother. There was a pause in which I could hear her making a note. She said, "How did your mother respond?" I said. She said they made the best decision they could with what they had. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said, "That is an admission," I said. "I know," she said. "In front of 7 witnesses," I said. "I know." She said she would follow up first thing Monday on the certified letter, which was now 5 days into its 14-day window. She said she expected to hear from my parents' attorney within the week, if they had one, and if they did not have one, she expected them to engage one quickly. She said the financial summary had been conservative, deliberately so, and that she was prepared to go significantly higher if they chose to litigate rather than settle. I said, "I don't want to litigate." She said, "I know. But it helps to know we can." We talked for 20 more minutes. By the end of the call, I had taken my coat off and put the kettle on and was standing in the kitchen in the yellow light, which felt like progress of a kind. Said Patricia, "Do you think they'll fight it?" She said, "Your father might want to. Your mother won't." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because she admitted it in front of her sister. That's the one she can't come back from." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. The next 3 days were quiet in the way that follows a storm. Not peaceful exactly. but emptied. Gerald called Sunday morning. I answered this time because I had decided I would deal with Gerald separately from my parents, and I did not want him to feel that what I was doing was directed at him. He said, "I've been up all night." I said, "I know." "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't apologize. Don't you dare apologize." His voice was rough, the way voices get when someone has been cycling through emotions for hours and has arrived at a specific exhausted clarity. He said, "I've been sitting here trying to think of what I want to say to you, and I can't find the right words." I said, "You don't need to find them right now. I want you to know that I would never have. If I had known." I said, "Gerald, I believe you," he said. "Does that matter? Does it help at all?" I thought about this honestly, the way I try to think about things that deserve an honest answer. I said, "It helps more than I expected it to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What happens now?" I said, "That depends on Mom and Dad," he said. "And if they don't respond to the letter," I said, "then Patricia takes the next step." He said, "I want to help. Whatever I can do. I want to be on the right side of this," I said. "Then stay out of the middle of it for now. Let it move the way it needs to move." He said, "Okay." He said he was sorry again, and I told him again not to be, and we hung up, and I sat with the strangeness of that conversation. My brother, who had unknowingly lived on what had been taken from me, wanting to make it right. I did not know yet what to do with that. I put it aside and let it be complicated. My parents' response came not through an attorney, but through my father, directly on the Wednesday of that week. He called at 7 in the morning, which was unlike him. Richard Mitchell was not an early caller, not a man who made emotional decisions before 9 a.m. The fact that he called at 7 told me he had not slept. I answered. He said, "Anna." I said, "Dad." He said, "I want to talk to you without attorneys involved. Before this goes further," I said, "you can talk to me. But anything we agree to goes through Patricia," he said. "I understand." A pause. "Your mother is not well," I said. "What does that mean?" He said she had not left the bedroom since Thanksgiving. She was not eating. He was worried about her. He said the stress of all of this, and here he paused, and I heard him choosing his words carefully. The way engineers choose load-bearing elements, the stress of the situation had affected her significantly. I said, "Dad, I hear that, and I'm sorry she's struggling. But I need you to understand that the situation she is stressed about is a situation she created," he said. "She did what she thought was right." I said, "She canceled my enrollment without my knowledge and told me my scholarship had been revoked due to a discrepancy that did not exist. Those are facts, they are documented. I need you to stop presenting them as a matter of perspective." He was quiet. I said, "Is she seeing a doctor?" He said he was going to call her physician that morning. I said, "Good, she should. And you both should speak to an attorney before the 14 days are up." He said, "Anna." His voice shifted. Something in it dropped, the way a structure drops when the thing holding it up is removed. He said, "I know what we did was wrong." I held the phone. He said, "I knew it then. I told her. At the time I told her I wasn't comfortable. But she had it all worked out and I didn't push back the way I should have." A pause. "That's not an excuse." "I know it's not an excuse." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "I'm sorry, Anna. I had waited 10 years to hear those words from someone in that house. I had imagined this moment, not in a dramatic way, not with fanfare, just occasionally, in quiet moments, wondering what it would feel like. I had thought it might feel like relief, like a door opening, like the specific satisfaction of a debt being acknowledged. What it actually felt like was smaller than that, and more real. It felt like a man on the phone, at 7 in the morning, who had held the wrong side of a decision for 10 years and had run out of road. It felt like the truth arriving without ceremony. The way most true things do. I said, "I appreciate you saying that," he said. "What do you need from us?" I said, "Respond to the letter. Engage an attorney. Work with Patricia in good faith." He said he would. I said, "And Dad? The next time you have a conversation, like the one you're telling me you had in 2014, where something doesn't feel right, and someone has it all worked out. Push back," he said. "I know." I said, "Okay." We hung up. Their attorney contacted Patricia 4 days later, 2 days before the 14-day window closed. He was a local estate and family law practitioner named Bouchard, methodical and unsurprised by the situation, which suggested he had heard the full account from my parents, and had given them an assessment they had not enjoyed receiving. The negotiation took 6 weeks. My parents did not have $214,000 in liquid assets. What they had was the house on Western Boulevard, which was assessed at $380,000 with a remaining mortgage of $94,000, leaving equity of approximately $286,000. What they also had, and what I had not known until Patricia's discovery process turned it up, was a joint investment account holding $67,000 that my mother had told Carol at some point in the preceding years was their retirement fund. Patricia said, "She told your aunt about a retirement account she didn't disclose to us in initial discovery." I said, "Of course she did. What we settled on, after 6 weeks of negotiation, was not money. Not exactly. It was something Patricia had suggested early in the process and which I had initially dismissed as too complicated, then reconsidered, then decided was exactly right." My parents signed a document. A formal, witnessed, notarized document, 3 pages, drafted by Patricia and reviewed by Bouchard, and signed by Richard and Diane Mitchell in Patricia's office on a Tuesday morning in January. The document acknowledged, in specific and unambiguous language, that on August 14, 2014, Diane Mitchell had contacted Hartwell University's enrollment office and requested cancellation of Anna Mitchell's enrollment without Anna's knowledge or consent. That the reason provided to the university, a family emergency, was false. That the scholarship funds released as a result had been redirected to cover the educational expenses of Gerald Mitchell. That Richard Mitchell had been aware of these actions. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue civil litigation. Patricia had also, separately and without my instruction but with my full approval when she told me, filed a formal report with Hartwell University's compliance office. Her copy, not mine, documenting the fraudulent misrepresentation made to the university in 2014. What the university chose to do with that information was their affair. I did not ask. I did not need to. The document was what I had said I wanted, in Patricia's office 3 months earlier, when she had asked me what outcome I was looking for. I wanted them to be unable to pretend it didn't happen. They signed it on a Tuesday morning. Patricia sent me a scan by noon. I opened it at my desk at Hartwell, in the building where the original record had been sitting for 10 years, and I read every word of it twice. Then I saved it to a folder on my desktop and went back to work. My mother called that afternoon. I let it ring. She left a voicemail, the first voicemail she had left me since Thanksgiving. Her voice on the recording was quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of its usual management, sounding closer to her actual age than the voice I had grown up with. She said she hoped I was well. She said she knew there was nothing she could say that would be adequate. She said she was sorry. The word landing plainly, without architecture around it, without explanation or context, or the passive constructions she usually deployed when acknowledging fault. Just, "I'm sorry, Anna, I listened to it twice. Then I saved it, the way I save things I might need later, and might also simply need to have." Gerald, for his part, had stopped taking money from our parents 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. He told me this himself, on the phone, without fanfare. He had found a new job, a smaller firm, less prestigious, but stable. He was moving to a cheaper apartment. He said he had done a lot of thinking about what it meant to benefit from something without asking where it came from. I said, "That's a good thing to think about." A pause. "I'm going to pay you back. I don't know how yet or how much or over how long. But I want you to know that I'm going to." I said, "Let's talk about that when you're ready." He said, "Okay." We stayed on the phone for a while after that, not talking about any of it, just talking. About his new apartment, about a book I was reading, about the weather in Hartford, which had turned bitterly cold in January the way it always did. It was the longest conversation we had ever had that was not about something he needed. It was, I thought, a beginning of something. Not a repair, exactly. Repairs implied returning to a prior state, and the prior state had been built on something false. This was different. This was 2 people who happened to share a history, starting carefully, from a more honest place. I did not know yet what it would become. I did not know yet what any of it would become. What my parents and I would be to each other in a year. In 5 years. Whether the signed document would be the end of something or the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. I had stopped trying to predict it. I had learned, in the month since finding that case file on a Wednesday afternoon in October, that the future has a way of arriving in shapes you did not plan for, and that the best preparation is not a script but a foundation. I had a foundation now. It had taken 10 years to build, but it was mine, and it was solid, and no one had made a phone call to take it away. 14 months have passed since that Thanksgiving. I want to tell you what that time has looked like, because I think the part that comes after the confrontation, the part that doesn't make it into the dramatic version of events, is actually the most important part. It is where you find out what you were building toward, and whether the thing you built can hold the weight of ordinary life. My apartment near Bushnell Park has a small second bedroom I use as a study. In January, 2 weeks after my parents signed the document, I took the river photograph out of a drawer where it had been sitting in its cardboard tube for 3 years. I had moved it from wall to wall and eventually stopped putting it up at all. And I had it properly framed. It hangs now above the desk in the study. The Connecticut River in late afternoon light, flat and gray and wide, the far bank a dark line of trees. I look at it when I am working, and I find it calming in a way that has something to do with the fact that it has always been mine, even when I had nowhere settled to put it. I was promoted in March. The title is Director of Financial Aid Compliance, which is a significant jump from senior officer, and which came with a salary increase that made me sit at my kitchen table for 10 minutes before I opened the offer letter the rest of the way. David Okafor, my original supervisor and now a colleague, sent me a one-line email when the announcement went out. This was inevitable. Congratulations. I printed it and put it in the manila folder in my filing cabinet, behind the form letter from 2014, because I liked the way the two documents felt next to each other. The work itself has not changed dramatically. I still pull records. I still trace the histories of files. I still know the system better than almost anyone in the building, which is a thing I worked for, and which I do not take for granted. What has changed is the scope of it. I now oversee a team of 6, and I am involved in policy decisions that shape how the university handles third-party contacts, identity verification, and enrollment actions going forward. The protocols we revised last spring, which require student confirmation for any third-party cancellation request, regardless of caller relationship to the student, were based in part on the gap that had existed in 2014. I did not tell my team why I cared so specifically about that gap. I did not need to. My parents sold the house on Western Boulevard in April. Not because they were forced to. The settlement had not required it, but because the mortgage had become difficult, and the house was large for 2 people. And I think, though my father has never said this directly, because the house had become a different kind of weight than it had been before. They moved to a smaller place in Wethersfield, a ranch-style house on a quiet street, closer to my father's brother Paul. My mother has resumed her church committee work. She is, by all accounts from Carol, who calls me occasionally now with updates that feel less like reconnaissance and more like genuine reaching out. Doing better than she was in the months immediately after Thanksgiving. I have not been to the new house. I have spoken to my mother 4 times since the document was signed. Short calls, careful, each one slightly less guarded than the last, which is a trajectory I am watching without forcing. She does not bring up what happened. I do not bring it up either. We talk about the weather, about work, about a recipe she made that she thought I might like. It is not a normal relationship, and I do not know if it will become one. What I know is that I am not pretending. That is new. For most of my life I pretended, in one form or another, that the house was fair, that the rules applied equally, that the scholarship had simply been revoked, that I had simply landed on my feet. I am done with pretending, and whatever relationship I have with my parents from here will be built on what is actually true, even if what is actually true is limited and imperfect and small. My father calls every 2 or 3 weeks. He asks about work, about the apartment, occasionally about Gerald. He does not say much that is substantial, but he calls, and he called consistently, even in the months when there was no reason to think I would be warm about it. And I have come to understand that this is his form of trying. It is not enough, and it is also something. I am learning to hold both of those things at once. Gerald and I have dinner once a month. This started in February tentatively at a Thai restaurant near his new apartment in Newington, a smaller place than his old one. 3rd floor, no parking, a kitchen window that faces a brick wall. He showed it to me with the slight self-consciousness of someone's presenting evidence of change. I told him it was a good kitchen. He made coffee and he sat and talked for 2 hours about nothing that mattered, and everything that did. Our childhoods, our memories of the same events from different angles, the years we had spent in the same house, operating under different versions of reality. He is paying back a portion of what our parents redirected. Not $214,000. That was never the point, and I never asked him for anything. What he is doing is making monthly transfers into an account he set up, modest amounts, consistent, which he said he was going to do until it felt like the right place to stop. I told him he didn't have to. He said he knew. We left it at that. At dinner last month, he brought his girlfriend, a woman named Simone, who teaches fourth grade and has strong opinions about coffee and easy laughter, and who looked at me across the table and said she had heard a lot about me. I said I hoped not too much. She said exactly the right amount. We stayed at the restaurant for 3 hours. Driving home afterward, I thought about the word family. What it contains, what it can survive, what it cannot. I do not have an answer that wraps cleanly. What I have instead is a working theory assembled from the last 14 months of evidence. That family is not the people who share your blood, and it is not the people who have always been kind to you. It is the people who, when the truth comes out, choose to be on the right side of it. Gerald chose. My father is trying, slowly, imperfectly, to choose. My mother is somewhere in the process of choosing. I do not rush her. I do not wait for her either. I live my life, which is full and structured and mine, and if she finds her way to a version of honesty that can hold a real conversation, I will be here, in October. Almost exactly 1 year after I found the case file, I was conducting a routine system audit, different batch, different years, different students, ordinary work. I pulled a file, logged it, moved to the next one. I did not think about case number, HR 2242081142. I did not look it up. It is still in the system, unchanged, time-stamped, patient. It will be there as long as the university keeps its digital records, which based on current archival policy is indefinitely. Some things, once documented, do not disappear. I find that comforting now, in a way I could not have predicted when I first read it. The file is not a wound anymore. It is as a record, and records, in my experience, are neutral. They do not carry anger or grief or the desire for vindication. They simply contain what happened, and they hold it accurately, and they make it available to anyone with the right access and the willingness to look. I had the access. I was willing to look. That, in the end, was all it took. The river photograph catches the afternoon light now. Between 3 and 4, when the sun comes through the study window, at a low angle, and hits the glass of the frame just so. And for an hour the room is full of a warm, specific brightness that I look forward to on the days when I am home to see it. I bought this apartment in August. Mine, on a 30-year mortgage with a down payment I had saved across 7 years of careful, patient arithmetic. The closing took 45 minutes. I signed everything myself. On the drive home I called no one. I parked in my parking space, which had my name on a small metal plate on the wall. Michelle, and I sat in the car for a moment in the quiet of the garage. Then I went upstairs, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the light change on the street below. I was 32 years old. I had a title, a team, a mortgage, a river photograph, a navy blue binder in a locked filing cabinet, and a brother who showed up to dinner and stayed 3 hours. I had built all of it myself, on ground that had always been solid, even when I could not see it. I had simply needed to find my way back to it. To anyone watching this who has been told that what was taken from you was your own fault, that you simply didn't plan well enough, didn't try hard enough, didn't land in the right place, I want you to hear this. The record does not lie. Whatever happened to you, somewhere there is a log, a timestamp, a name. The truth of what you live does not disappear because someone told a cleaner story over it. You are allowed to look, you are allowed to find it, and you are allowed to walk into that room, set the binder on the table, and let the silence do the work that 10 years of noise could not. If this story reached you tonight, if you have ever had your future quietly cancelled by someone who was supposed to protect it, leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. I read everyone. Like this video if it meant something to you. Subscribe if you want to stay. And to whoever needed to hear this tonight, you already know what you know. Trust it.